on and working closely with co-chair Merkley and of course ranking member McGovern, because this is an issue that is getting worse, not better. And so we are trying to bring a focus on it. We've introduced legislation. It's totally bipartisan. Senator Merkley, Jim McGovern, and I and others have sponsored it, which is pending now in both the House and the Senate. In June 2021, on the 32nd anniversary of the 1989 student democracy protests, which, as we all know, ended in the horrific Tiananmen Square massacre, I visited Liberty Sculpture Park in Yermo, California, to witness the unveiling of a sculpture made by artist Chen Weiming. It was a 20-foot tall statue that morphed Xi Jinping's skull with a coronavirus molecule, and Chen named it the CCP virus. It was a bold work of art, rightfully assigning blame to the CCP and Xi Jinping in particular for the horrific pandemic and all the mistakes that were made, especially in the early months that shook the world. I was honored to attend, to see Chen's work, and to join him and other heroes of the Chinese democracy in speaking out against the atrocities committed by the Chinese Communist Party. Less than 2 months later, however, the sculpture was gone. It was vandalized and then burned to the ground, likely by a band of CCP agents targeting Chen and other Chinese democracy activists here in the United States to punish and scare them into silence. At the ceremony, there were Chinese Communist Party agents in attendance. Unfortunately, Chen's case is not a rare case. With us that day in Yermo was Wei Jingsheng, perhaps the greatest advocate for Chinese human rights and democracy of our time. Very few people know this, but in May of 2022, while driving right here in Washington, a car swerved in front of Wei's car, suddenly braked in front of him while another rammed him from behind. Both cars quickly fled the scene. Wei believes, and I also believe, that this was an attempt on Wei's life. This, incidentally, is the same tactic that I have heard used over and over against other Chinese individuals who have run afoul of the CCP. And the list goes on. Major Shi Yang, who served in the U.S. Army and who ran for Congress in New York City, was stalked and harassed by Chinese agents here in the United States. Pastor Bob Fu, who I've known for over 2 decades, a leading advocate on behalf of Christians and human rights activists and defenders trying to escape China, was threatened with a bomb at his home in Texas. The brave 8 Hong Kongers whose heads the authorities have placed on bounties and harassed with their families just this past summer, solely for speaking out against the atrocities happening in their beloved Hong Kong. Indeed, I know that group includes a number of individuals whose outspokenness led them to testify here at the China Commission, so this is really personal for all of us on this panel. It also becomes personal when I hear about fellow legislator from a sister democracy who has been harassed for speaking out about human rights in China. Member of Parliament Michael Chong of Canada was harassed for what Senator Merkley and I have repeatedly done, calling the Chinese Communist Party's treatment of Uyghurs what it is, a genocide. And although Michael has been harassed, he is not in any way, shape, or form intimidated. And he is joining us today at the witness panel, will be the first panel to speak to us today. My friends, the Chinese Communist Party has waged a pervasive, coercive campaign around the world against anyone who does not agree with the party. They target Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, Tibetans, dissidents, activists, students, journalists, or anyone who dares to state their unapproved opinions about the People's Republic of China. The Chinese Communist Party uses modern technology to digitally harass and surveil individuals around the globe. They abuse the Interpol system to punish and return those who exercise their freedom of speech while abroad. They detain and harass dissidents, families and friends back in China, to unjustly attempt to coerce silence, like the sister of Rushan Abbas, who will join us here this morning in panel number 2. And they even use direct physical assaults beyond their borders to control what is said and about their country and its wrongdoing. Recently, we've seen them go so far as to set up shop right here in the United States, establishing illegal police stations here in New York City to surveil and harass Chinese immigrants on our soil. The Chinese Communist Party's strategy of trying to rewrite global norms has succeeded in far too many cases. This has led to self-censorship and curtailment of basic freedoms, even here in the United States of America. Students scared to speak out, journalists scared to write, free citizens scared to attend gatherings. All of this happening beyond China's borders and within ours. Indeed, as Michael Chong's testimony illustrates, and as underscored in news just this past weekend from Great Britain, where an alleged spy worked in Parliament, it is also happening within our legislatures. We cannot and will not let the Chinese Communist Party in any way intimidate us or scare us into submission through these tactics. Today, we will hear from experts and victims alike who have seen these stories up close. We must work to protect freedoms of speech, assembly, and opinion, both here in the United States as well as elsewhere, and including in the People's Republic of China. I'd like to yield to our distinguished co-chair, Senator Merkley.
Thank you very much, Chairman Smith. Transnational repression is central to the Chinese Communist Party's strategy of silencing critics of Chinese policy around the world. It affects so many of the Uyghurs, the Hong Kongers, the Tibetans, the human rights advocates, the journalists, and others this commission works with on a daily basis. This hearing gives us a chance to give a platform to some of the victims and experts from across the globe who have been most engaged in trying to identify ways we can address this vexing challenge. We know from past testimony that it isn't easy, as the Chinese Communist Party's sophisticated tactics seem to know no bounds and bring the power of a ruthless state against individual dissidents, members of Chinese diaspora, and insidiously their family members in China. That's why it's so critical that we redouble the efforts to wrap our minds around the dimensions of this threat, to raise awareness globally, to identify ways to build common cause with those who have been targeted, religious groups, activists, journalists, politicians, as well as governments sick and tired of the brazen violation of sovereignty transnational repression represents. Last year, I chaired another hearing on this topic to hear about what the Biden administration is doing about it, and I'm proud that one of the officials at the forefront of that work, Undersecretary Azrazea, is now one of our commissioners. The State Department is dedicated and is continuing to apply significant time and attention to develop a more comprehensive strategy to counter, deter, mitigate these threats. We have also seen the Department of Justice make important strides in pursuing criminal charges against groups and individuals accused of engaging in transnational repression. But despite these efforts, this commission's reporting shows how far we have to go. We continue to track a disturbing number of cases of transnational repression, both here in the United States and abroad, with the knowledge that countless others are taking place and likely not being reported on. I imagine that for every case we hear, there's another 10 we don't know about. We have seen egregious harassment campaigns, even against legislators in the world, including Honorable Michael Chong, who is here as a member of the Canadian House of Commons. We have seen relentless targeting of young activists who have spoken out bravely against the increasingly repressive conditions in Hong Kong. And we have seen the unrelenting pressure that continues to be directed at Uyghurs around the world. We know this is, as Freedom House calls it, the most sophisticated global and comprehensive campaign of transnational repression in the world. It relies on surveillance technology, spyware, threats to individuals through phone calls or face-to-face intimidation, and even harassment of family members and friends back in China. As Safeguard Defenders revealed in an eye-opening report earlier this year, the PRC is also responsible for establishing at least 102 overseas service stations in at least 53 countries, breaching national sovereignty and coercing Chinese diaspora members to return to the PRC for criminal investigations. All of this requires that the United States and as many other governments as possible, and we do need international cooperation to make this effective, make it a priority to address this issue. That's why earlier this year I introduced the Transnational Repression Policy Act, joined on a bipartisan basis by my colleagues, Senator Rubio, Senator Cardin, Senator Hagerty, and the Senate, to hold foreign governments and individuals accountable when they stalk, intimidate, or assault people across borders. I appreciate Chairman Smith's work to lead the House companion to this legislation. If enacted, the Transnational Repression Policy Act would mandate additional U.S. government reporting on the issue, require training for U.S. diplomatic and law enforcement personnel, bolster intelligence community efforts to track and share information on these incidents, and develop a more effective tip line for victims and witnesses. I'm working to get this bill passed. I think it's essential that we do, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today who are bringing their experience, their story to bear on this very important issue.
Thank you, Chairman Merkley. I'd like to now yield to the ranking member, Jim McGovern.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I join my colleagues in welcoming the witnesses today and the public to CECC's hearing on transnational repression. Transnational repression occurs when governments reach across borders to silent dissent among diasporas and exiles, including through assassinations, illegal deportations, abductions, digital threats, Interpol abuse, and family intimidation. Our focus today is on the practices of the People's Republic of China, but transnational repression can be carried out not just by unfriendly governments, but also by strategic allies. It can target people anywhere they or their families reside or visit, even in democracies like the United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, Australia, South Africa, and here in the United States. That's why I worked with Senator Merkley during the 117th Congress as he led the development of the Transnational Repression Policy Act, and why I'm proud to co-lead the same bill, H.R. 3654 in the House, this Congress with Chairman Smith. It is critically important to make sure that the United States government has the tools it needs to confront this global challenge, both domestically and internationally. I turn now to China. Freedom House's database on transnational repression now includes information on 854 direct physical incidents committed by 38 governments in 91 countries around the world since 2014. China is an origin country for 253 of those recorded incidents, a stunning 30%. As we will hear today, the PRC targets abroad the same populations it represses internally, especially Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, and Tibetans. State agents linked to the security and police forces have engaged in forced rendition of asylum seekers, street assaults, digital surveillance, online harassment, and the coercion and intimidation of family members and friends of dissidents. We must be sure that we have the knowledge and the capacity to protect the people who are targets of these practices, especially those who are within U.S. jurisdiction. And we must do a better job of engaging with partner countries and strengthening multilateral strategies to counter the PRC's actions, which violate international human rights, among them the right to freedom of expression, association, asylum, and freedom of movement, and the prohibition on arbitrary detention. So I look forward to this hearing today. I thank the witnesses again, and I look forward to hearing their recommendations. And with that, I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. It's my honor to, this commission, as I think all of you know, or most of you know, is not only bicameral and bipartisan, it also includes distinguished members of the executive branch. We are joined by one of those members, Undersecretary Yuzera Zaya, and I yield the floor to her.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Smith and Co-Chair Merkley and Ranking Member McGovern and fellow commissioners. I'm honored to be with you all today for this important discussion on the increasingly pervasive and concerning use of transnational repression by PRC authorities. Transnational repression, or TNR, is a global phenomenon, but the PRC's efforts are especially pervasive, pronounced, and persistent. The PRC uses TNR to harass and threaten Uyghurs, Tibetans, members of other ethnic and religious minority groups, Hong Kongers, and PRC citizens and non-PRC citizens living abroad who seek only to exercise their human rights and fundamental freedoms. As we've heard from the co-chairs and ranking member, the PRC utilizes a wide variety of tactics, including online harassment, exit bans, or imprisonment of family members of targeted individuals, the misuse of international law enforcement systems such as Interpol, and pressure on other governments to forcibly return targeted individuals to the PRC. The sheer breadth and depth of their efforts cannot be ignored and should not be permitted to continue. It is a direct affront to national sovereignty and impacts people all over the world, including U.S. citizens and individuals residing in the United States. This is why, since 2021, the Biden-Harris administration has made combating transnational repression a global human rights priority. One way that we've sought to counter this scourge is through our diplomatic engagement and tools. We continue to engage the PRC directly, making clear in no uncertain terms that their conduct is unacceptable, and must stop. We have not, and we will not keep quiet in the face of these transgressions. We've used sanctions as an accountability tool as well. Specifically, in March 2022, we imposed visa restrictions on PRC officials responsible for or complicit in transnational repression. This administration energized the interagency to combat TNR in the United States as well. U.S. government agencies have increased their domestic engagement with domestic communities targeted by the PRC. This outreach helps to create improved two-way communication, which both enhances our understanding of the threat and helps those affected more quickly access government assistance when they are targeted or even before this occurs. We've also jump-started international cooperation to drive a global response because it's not only Americans and U.S. residents who have suffered abuses. Specifically, we deployed interagency teams to meet with foreign counterparts to raise their awareness of this threat and to share our own lessons learned. One example of this effort is the recent launch of a G7 Rapid Response Mechanism Working Group on TNR. This coalition will raise international awareness of the threat TNR poses to democratic values and deepen our shared commitment to countering it. The experiences and details presented by today's panelists will surely highlight the very real threat of the PRC's transnational repression activities, as well as the need for governments, legislators, activists, and others to continue to work even more closely together to counter it. Hearing your stories, and in some cases learning from what you have gone through personally, are vitally important as we advance our common cause. The administration welcomes Congress's ongoing leadership on these issues, and we look forward to further deepening our collaboration. Thank you again for this opportunity to speak, and thank you all for coming together today to confront this challenge.
Madam Undersecretary, thank you very much for your leadership and for joining us at this hearing today. It's now my honor to yield to Senator Sullivan, a new member of the commission.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your outstanding leadership on this. It's great to see my colleague from the U.S. Senate and the co-chair, Senator Merkley. This is such an important topic. The effort, often successful, of the Chinese Communist Party to reach far beyond its borders to target critics in the diaspora communities throughout the world is outrageous. But let's face it, it's just one of many outrageous things Beijing is doing across the board. As this committee has done an excellent job of doing, we need to continue to recognize and highlight the brutal nature of the Chinese Communist Party regime we are dealing with, especially under the dictatorial rule of Xi Jinping. Look no further than the string of strange disappearances that we've seen in China, in their government in the last couple of months. The Chinese foreign minister and former ambassador to the United States disappeared. This was Xi Jinping's right-hand man until recently. The commander and deputy commander of the PLA rocket forces, gone. Now, apparently, the defense minister is gone. Who knows what's going on here? But to be clear, this is the sort of regime we're dealing with, a regime whose officials suddenly disappear without any explanation. They're probably somewhere in China with bullets in their heads in ditches. This is the way the CCP operates. And now Xi Jinping is trying to export this. Just a couple months ago, authorities in Hong Kong issued arrest warrants for activists and lawyers accused of violating the CCP-imposed national security law, specifically for people who no longer live in Hong Kong, or anywhere in China for that matter. Hong Kong has declared it will pursue these people for life, and it's not unthinkable that they could one day make good on grabbing them. Of course, I'm not worried about the United States aiding in their return, or the UK, or Australia, or Japan, or other places where they now reside, but life is long. They all travel. One day they could find themselves in the hand of a government all too eager to burnish its credentials with Beijing. This is one of the reasons, Mr. Chairman, I'm working with Representative John Curtis on a bill to press the Biden administration to sanction the prosecutors and judges and other officials responsible for enforcing these unjust Hong Kong laws. The days of the independence of the Hong Kong judiciary system and the rule of law in Hong Kong are unfortunately long gone. Beijing has seen to that. Now we need to do what we can to try to even up the scales on behalf of the people of Hong Kong. Mr. Chairman, there's one more issue that I want to just raise in my opening statement. These kind of aggressive actions are also targeting Americans directly and even remarkably during times of tragedy. I'd like to submit for the record this New York Times story that just broke last night entitled, "China Sows Disinformation About Hawaii Fires Using New Techniques."
That objection, so on.
This story that just broke in the New York Times talks about how when wildfires swept across Maui last month, killing over 100 Americans, the CCP unleashed its information warriors. They said on the internet the disaster was not natural. In a flurry of false posts and lies that spread across the internet, they said the natural disaster was the result of a secret weather weapon being tested by the United States military and intel agencies. To bolster this lie, they posted photographs that were generated by artificial intelligence programs. Mr. Chairman, as we all know, when countries around the world suffer natural disasters, even adversaries come together to help each other, not under Xi Jinping's rule. The Chinese Communist Party is now trying to sow discord among Americans as we sadly bury our own dead in Hawaii. This is outrageous, and I call on the Chinese ambassador to the United States to formally apologize to our country. But, Mr. Chairman, he won't, because if he did, he'd disappear too. We all know that. One final thing, Mr. Chairman, I just want to say how honored I am to join this commission. It has such a great history, especially under your leadership. At a time when many people are raising questions about Congress's decisions in the past relating to China, for example, extending MFN 20 years ago, it is good to remind Americans that at the same time, the Congress also established organizations like this one to keep a critical eye on human rights. I think there may be more Congress can do to live up to this commission's mandate, perhaps even expand it. But as the new guy here, I'm eager to learn from my colleagues about how the commission works, and I'm very honored to be part of that. With that, Mr. Chairman, I again I'm very glad to be here and look forward to working with you and all the members of this distinguished commission.
Thank you so very much, Commissioner, and for your very eloquent remarks, and welcome to the commission. We're so glad to have you. I'd like to now recognize Congresswoman Commissioner Salinas.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can be brief. I just want to thank you, the co-chairs, for today's hearing. Ranking Member McGovern is critically important. I want to thank the witnesses for coming here to testify. And like our newest member, I too am eager to continue to learn and really hopefully figure out what some tools are to provide some accountability around this. This is sounds like a global problem and something that is not just affecting human rights, but also affects the way we do business globally and around the world with trade. So I want to thank you all for conducting today's hearing.
Thank you so very much. I'd like to now recognize Commissioner Ryan Zinke.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Senator Merkley for holding this hearing. And on this side of the aisle, we have the Marine and Navy team. We'll try to do our best. But Mr. Chairman, on June 24th, 2012, Dr. Shane Truman Todd, a young American engineer, was found hanging in his Singapore apartment a week before his scheduled return to the United States. Although Dr. Todd had repeatedly expressed fear about the work he was doing from and to a Chinese company, authorities immediately ruled his death a suicide. His family initially didn't know what to believe. However, this started to change when they arrived in Singapore, and evidence seemed to suggest murder and not suicide. The narrative changed when they discovered what they had thought was a speaker was actually an external hard drive with thousands of backup files from Dr. Todd's computer. What the data revealed by those files changed the narrative from a tragic suicide and loss of a son to an international story of deceit and cover-up. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter Chapter 11 of Mrs. Todd's book entitled Hard Drive, A Family's Fight Against Three Countries, to the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And if any member would like hard copies of it, we will certainly make those available. But I yield the balance of my time and I look forward to hearing your testimony, Minister Chong, and thank you again for holding this hearing.
Thank you very much. Before I introduce our very distinguished Member of Parliament, I just want to point out that a number of us met with the wife of Liu Shiwei several weeks ago. He is in Laos, and it's not looking good, and my hope is that the Laotian government will rethink forcible repatriation of this amazing man back to China, where he faces a very, very terrible future. In meeting with his wife, and all the human rights organizations have rallied behind him. There's a total solidarity there, I'm happy to say. She couldn't have been more persuasive, loving towards her husband, and she made it so clear that if the West and all countries in the democracies don't speak up, his future is so bleak. So all of our appeal would be to the Laotian government that they cease and desist any kind of forcible repatriation. This commission is very honored to welcome the Honorable Michael Chong here today, as he will testify to the depth of the levels that the Chinese Communist Party has gone in its transnational repression campaign, going so far as to attempt to coerce foreign members of parliament in countries with strong democratic roots simply for speaking out against human rights atrocities. Mr. Chong was first elected to the Parliament of Canada in 2004 and represents the riding of Wellington-Halton Hills. He is currently the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs for the official opposition and Vice Chair of the Special Committee on the Canada-People's Republic of China relationship. Mr. Chong has served in the federal cabinet as President of the Queen's Privy Council, Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, and Minister for Support. For Chong, he also served as chair of several House of Commons standing committees. It is a true honor and a privilege for Mr. Chong to join us today, though it's unfortunately due to the unacceptable and outrageous overreach of the Chinese Communist Party, after calling CCP's treatment of the Uyghurs what it is, a genocide. Mr. Chong receives threats personally, and members of his family living in Hong Kong have been targeted as a result. Chinese Communist Party not only seeks to silence its critics at home, it has gone so far as to harass thousands of people abroad for speaking the truth about their totalitarian regime. As a fellow legislator, my colleagues and I are appalled at the attempts to censorship you and others who have bravely spoken out, as you have as well. We welcome you, and please consume however much time you would like.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Thank you, Co-Chairman Merkley, Ranking Member McGovern, Senator Sullivan, Representatives Salinas and Zinke. Thank you very much for having me in front of your commission today. I understand that you're interested in my experience of Beijing's transnational repression, or what we also call foreign interference. Like millions of Canadians and Americans, I'm the child of immigrants. My mother immigrated from the Netherlands, and my father immigrated from Hong Kong. I've extended family in both the Netherlands and Hong Kong. I've been elected since 2004 to represent the District of Wellington-Halton Hills, and I've served in the federal cabinet and chaired several parliamentary committees. In 2020, I was appointed the official opposition's shadow minister for foreign affairs. Since then, my criticisms of Beijing have increased in response to President Xi's increasing violations of the rules-based international order and its repression in the PRC and abroad. In November 2020, I introduced a motion adopted by the House of Commons calling on the Canadian government to make a decision on Huawei's involvement in Canada's 5G network within 30 days, and to develop a robust plan to combat China's growing foreign operations in Canada and its increasing intimidation of Canadians living in Canada. Several months later, in February, I introduced another motion, which the House also adopted, recognizing Beijing's actions towards Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims as a genocide. In May this year, I learned that a PRC diplomat working out of the PRC consulate in Toronto had, since 2020, been gathering information to further target me and my family in Hong Kong. Last month, I learned I was the target of a disinformation campaign in May of this year on the Chinese language social media platform WeChat. The Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs concluded that Beijing's role in this disinformation operation was highly probable. But my experience is but one case of Beijing's interference in Canada. Many, many other cases go unreported and unnoticed, and the victims suffer in silence. This has serious implications for the approximately 4% of Canadians, some 1.7 million Canadians of Chinese descent. Beijing targets these diaspora groups using a variety of tactics. One tactic is to target the many Chinese international students in Canada, coaching them into participating in foreign interference threat activities on university campuses, such as targeting pro-Hong Kong democracy activists and Tibetan and Uyghur human rights campaigners. Other tactics include targeting Chinese language media and social media in Canada, the establishment of illegal police stations in Canada, the wrongful detention and arrest and detention of Canadians, such as Michael Kovrig, Michael Spavor, and the currently detained Hussein Jalil, whose whereabouts is completely unknown. And another tactic includes coercing Canadians on Canadian soil back to the People's Republic of China. Recently, the PRC has used a tactic of creating wanted lists and offering bounties of the arrest of those from Canada. These various tactics are a serious and concerted effort to interfere with democratic activity in Canada and leave millions of Canadians at risk of being intimidated, coerced, silenced, and unable to enjoy the basic democratic rights and freedoms guaranteed in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in our Constitution. These tactics cannot be tolerated in a free and sovereign country. Canada must work more closely with democratic allies like the United States in countering Beijing's efforts to interfere in our democratic life. Foreign interference is a serious national security threat to Canada. It threatens our economy, our long-term prosperity, social cohesion, our parliament, and our elections. It requires a suite of measures to combat, including closer cooperation amongst allied democracies. Canada must work toward a stronger defense and security partnership with the United States and allies. We must look for every opportunity to strengthen this partnership, to meet the challenge of rising authoritarianism, and to preserve our fundamental freedoms, our democracy, and the rule of law. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chong, for your excellent testimony and for your leadership. Just a couple of questions, and I'll yield to my colleagues for any questions they might have. When you talked about closer cooperation, are you persuaded that we are cooperating now? Is it as robust as it should be? And what is being left undone and unaddressed?
Well, thank you, Chairman Smith, for that question. I think there are a number of ways in which we can cooperate in a better way. So, for example, the United States has long had a Foreign Agents Registry Act since 1938. Australia more recently introduced one, I think in 2019. The UK just adopted one 2 months ago in July. The government of Canada has announced that it's taking a look at introducing one in Canada to give law enforcement a tool to prosecute Beijing's agents operating on our own soil. And so I think one way in which we could better cooperate is exchange information on legislative best models to see what works and what doesn't. We have similar judicial systems in our democracies. So that's one area of cooperation. Another area, for example, is how do we use sunlight and transparency to counter foreign interference threat activities? Our security agencies and services, our experts have told us that often foreign interference, transnational repression doesn't rise to the level of a criminal prosecution. And so one way to counter it is to make it public, to go public with the intelligence, to tell members of the public, members of Congress, members of Parliament, here's what exactly is going on, to arm citizens and elected officials with the information they need to protect themselves. So best practices on how to do that during elections and between elections. So those are just two examples of where I think we could more closely cooperate.
You know, I mentioned a list of things that had done to people that I know, that we know as a commission, who have been outspoken. I would point out that Anna Kwok, who is here today with us in the back, she has testified in the past here, this year, on behalf of Hong Kong. She has a bounty on her head. I mean, there's no let up by the repressive tactics employed by Xi Jinping. And even Chen Quanzhang, who I worked to help release years ago, they, meaning he assumes it was the Chinese Communist Party, in order to send a message that they were watching, went into his home when he and his wife and family were out and rearranged everything. They didn't destroy anything, they just rearranged it to let him know we've been here. Rabia Kadir, the great Uyghur human rights activist, similarly has had one instance after another. And I'm wondering, you know, looking at you, here you are, a high-profile, member of parliament, and yet they're doing this against you. You know, I was put on the hit list by Global Times a couple of years ago. I was briefed by the FBI. It nowhere nearly comes to what you're going through, believe me. But they said, watch out for social media, watch out for other things that they may do. They refused to give me a visa. I'm trying to put together a trip that would go to Xinjiang after their foreign ministry said, we have nothing to hide. Anybody wants to come, come. We sent a letter to the embassy and said, I want to come. Please approve it. And we have not heard back from them since. But we're going to keep trying. I say this because, you know, the level of angst directed against you, and you have family members at risk, we need to rally behind you and others like you who have family especially. They could do a lot here, but to people in Hong Kong or anywhere else in the PRC, they could do a lot more. So that's why redoubling our efforts, passing this legislation, sharing best practices is so important. You know, in reference to the PRC's different information campaign against you on WeChat, could you elaborate what that looked like?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Smith. So what happened with me is that in May of this year, while a big debate was going on in Canada about foreign interference, a number of narratives, false narratives about me, popped up on Chinese language social media, particularly on the WeChat platform. And these narratives persisted for about a week, and the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs concluded that they emanated from Chinese Communist Party accounts. This is corrosive because WeChat in Canada has over 1 million users, and some 5 million people globally, including many in Canada, saw that disinformation. And so they have weaponized Chinese language social media, Chinese media such as CGTN, the state broadcaster. They've weaponized the targeting of radio stations and television stations. I know that in the UK, just a couple of years ago, Ofcom, their broadcast regulator, pulled CGTN off the air, off of television because of human rights violations and disinformation that was being spread. So those are, that's something I think democracies have to grapple with. Best practices on how to do that, I think, is critically important, because one of the things we need to do is we need to balance our fundamental belief in free speech, free expression, the free media, freedom of communication, with the need to counter this disinformation. Chairman Smith, you also mentioned how the PRC is using money to corrupt our system, and I think that's another area for cooperation. Often transnational repression comes alongside corruption, alongside personal illicit gain, payments of monies or consideration, money laundering, and so I think countering that money laundering, countering the proceeds of illicit gain, I think, is something where democracies also need to work more closely on. And the United States being the world's reserve currency and the US dollar being the main means of transaction in our global economy, I think we can do a lot together to counter this repression that takes in the form of financial corruption.
Before my time runs out, just two things. Is the Canadian government standing very, very in solidarity with you and everyone else? Very briefly on that. And on the college campuses, what is the government doing, not the government, PRC doing vis-a-vis minority religions?
Yes, since the spring, the Canadian government has been standing up and supporting me. I think before that point in time, there were issues that have popped up, but they are now, like many other democracies, reacting to the threat. Like I said, the UK just adopted a foreign agents registry 2 months ago. The Canadian government has announced it will be introducing one. So, democracies are often slow to react to the threat of authoritarian states, which can act much more quickly because it's one person or few people rule. So yes, they have been supportive of me in recent months. On university campuses, what is going on is that there are, I believe, over 100,000 Chinese international students at Canada's leading research universities. Often these students are coached and coerced into participating in foreign interference threat activities on Canadian university campuses. For example, just a couple of years ago, there was a Tibetan human rights activist at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus. She had campaigned for president of student council. She had won that election, and she was immediately targeted by students through a coordinated effort by the PRC consulate. A similar thing happened at the McMaster University campus in Hamilton, Ontario, where a Uyghur human rights activist was similarly targeted by students through a coordinated action of the PRC consulate. So these are the kinds of coercive activities taking place on university campuses.
Thank you. Co-Chair Merkley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And following up on that impact on university campuses, in your testimony, you note that international students were compelled to demonstrate against pro-Hong Kong rallies after threats were made, quote, to withhold their government scholarships or harm their families back home. In your estimation, this is not just a one-off. This is a systemic strategy to use the Chinese students who are present to essentially create a pro-China force on campuses?
Yes, I think it is a systemic, long-term effort to create fear on university campuses. I just highlighted 2 examples of what's happened, but we've heard about many other cases on university campuses, and often the Chinese international students who are conducting these activities are themselves being coerced into doing it. Not in all cases, but in many cases. And so yes, it is a pervasive threat on university campuses.
And I've also read about strategies that China is using in which they essentially recruit some of the Chinese students to spy on other Chinese students who might be participating in critiquing China's policies or participating in protests against Chinese activities in Hong Kong or against Uyghurs and so forth. Is that something that you've observed in Canada as well?
Yes, we have observed that. At our committee in the House of Commons, we heard testimony from witnesses who highlighted exactly that going on, that these students were being coerced into spying on other students, threatening other students from the PRC who weren't towing the PRC line, and doing so under threat of having their scholarships withdrawn or their family targeted back home.
Is there an effort to establish a channel through which students can report these strategies of coercion so we can get a better grip on how widespread it is and ponder ways to address it?
Well, there is a center that Canadians can call to report foreign interference threat activities, but I don't think it's broadly made available to Chinese international students or promoted amongst that community. Again, it's an area where we could learn from each other on best practices on how to counter this threat, and where I think allied democracies can learn from each other on how to counter this.
Also I'll shift gears here from the campuses, and thank you for those insights. You note in your testimony that there's significant influence in Mandarin language news outlets. And, I would have thought that often those news outlets in our democracies would be a place that would kind of particularly be interested in reporting on China's abuses, but they're being co-opted. What is the strategy being employed there? Why is it effective?
Well, I think the strategy is multi-pronged. So, for example, there are state broadcasters from the PRC that are on the airwaves in democracies, such as CGTN, the PRC state broadcaster. It often promotes the propaganda right out of the Chinese Communist Party, and those broadcasts are seen by millions of people around the world. They often, people close to the Chinese Communist Party leadership have often taken ownership of newspapers and radio stations, and we've noticed that there's been a shift in the editorial stance of those newspapers. So, for example, Tsingtao Daily is the largest Chinese language newspaper in Canada. Its former editor is Victor Ho, and he has told us in testimony in front of our committee that the newspaper is largely now a vehicle for Chinese Communist Party propaganda and views, compared to when he was the editor, where it was truly an independent newspaper that operated freely of any control from Beijing.
I think that's a really important point. But is it the Chinese government that's buying these outlets? Is it Chinese corporations or affluent Chinese individuals? How are they securing ownership control?
It's not directly owned by the state. These are individuals, these are assets that have been purchased by individuals that are close to the PRC. For example, we've seen recently that a couple of years ago that the South China Morning Post, the largest English language newspaper in Hong Kong, changed ownership. And there's suggestions that its editorial stance has changed because of that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I want to close with the question as to whether any of your family back in China have ever been threatened as a result of your conversations.
Well, my experience is, I think, illustrative of what is happening to many Canadians and Americans and other citizens of other democracies. Out of an abundance of caution, I've cut off contact with my family in Hong Kong in order to ensure that they are somewhat insulated from the work that I'm doing here. And I know, in talking to members of diaspora communities across Canada and in the United States, that many other people have done the same thing. And so this is the consequence, one of the consequences of the PRC's transnational repression.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Minister, welcome, and thank you again for your courage for being here. What you're doing, even as we speak, in terms of your testimony, takes an enormous amount of courage, and I just want to let you know how much we admire it and appreciate it, because it takes people like you to speak out, even though you do so with threats and risks to your family. So really appreciate that. I want to just touch on a couple points that I raised in my opening statement, but your point about sticking together democracies, can you expand on this a little bit more, particularly in light of the fact that we've seen the Chinese Communist Party's strategy is to often try to isolate and single out certain democracies. You know, they were really pounding Lithuania from an economic standpoint. Australia, they undertook this big coercive economic, essentially blockade. And can you tell just a little bit more on how important it is for all of us as democracies to push back together, stick together, and that brings us power and strength, particularly when they try to pick off smaller countries, which I know is part of their strategy?
Well, thank you, Senator, for that question. I mentioned how we can work more closely together on translating intelligence into public disclosure.
Yeah.
Our members of the public have talked a bit about, working together to figure out how do we counter disinformation during targeting elected officials and our elections while still upholding fundamental freedoms of free speech. Foreign agent registry is another area for cooperation. Talked a bit about how we can cooperate on transnational financial crimes, which often come alongside foreign interference. But another area for cooperation is combating repression within the People's Republic of China. For example, we know that much of the cotton and many of the tomatoes produced in Xinjiang province in Western China are being produced through the forced labor of Uyghurs.
Yeah.
And we know that those products are being exported around the world. I think the United States has done an excellent job in enforcing bans on the importation of products like tomatoes and cotton that have been produced using that forced labor. As I understand it, some 2,500 shipments from the PRC in the last 2 or 3 years have been seized by U.S. border officials and prevented from coming into the United States. In Canada, we've yet to seize one shipment. There was a single shipment that was seized but later released. We have evidence that those products continue to flow into Canada, and I think that's an area where we should learn from U.S. best practices on stopping these products from coming into our country. We're part of a North American free trade zone. We can't be the place where these products have a back door to come in. So that is another example of where I think we could work much more closely with a democracy like the United States to learn on how to implement these sorts of bans.
Thank you. Let me follow up on your points on transparency, working together. I also believe it's important, particularly for regimes like this that, often only recognize power and threats to their own viability. As you know, the Chinese Communist Party's #1 goal is to stay in power, way above anything else. The welfare of their people, they could care less, as long as they stay in power. So here's another question I have for you. I also think it's important we go on a little bit of offense, right? Covertly, overtly, collectively. A lot of the CCP leadership we know is corrupt. We know they steal from their own people. We know that they're very rich from their corruption. Don't you think it makes sense, particularly like I'm saying, as the Chinese are trying to sow discord, literally as people in Hawaii are burying our fellow Americans? Just outrageous. That we should also go on offense, let the Chinese people know how corrupt their leaders are, that they're all very rich because they steal from their people. Don't you think we should be going on offense, covertly, overtly? You want to mess with us? Okay, we'll mess with you, and maybe we'll bring your leadership down. Don't you think we should be doing that?
Well, I think that's a very good point you make, Senator. I think of past decades before the rise of the internet and modern communication technologies, where shortwave radio was often used as a way to ensure that people in authoritarian states were receiving news and information that wasn't the propaganda of the state. And I think in this day and age, we should be funding VPN technologies that will allow people behind great firewalls like the one in the PRC to access news and information from the outside world, so that they actually get the truth rather than propaganda.
Well, I think it's also very true, and I'm sure you would agree, that Xi Jinping's biggest weakness is that he fears his own people. That's why he's killing all of his close associates, or at least disappearing them. I don't know where they are. They're probably dead. Let me get back to this issue of the nature of the regime, because I think you understand it more than most. But it's often right in front of our faces, and we don't want to recognize it. Let me give you a broader example. You know, it's really interesting to me that you read Xi Jinping's speeches, you watch what he says publicly, you look at who he emulates. The guy emulates Mao Zedong, right? There's no doubt about it. He's trying to model himself on Mao Zedong. If you just do a little bit of reading of the history of Mao Zedong, he's one of the most brutal dictators in the history, maybe of the world. The Black Book of Communism estimates that he killed probably 50 to 60 million of his own citizens. And the current leader of China emulates him. That would be like the Chancellor of Germany emulating Hitler. So what does it say about the nature of the regime that the current leader of China emulates one of the most brutal dictators in the history of the world? Shouldn't we be concerned about that? But shouldn't it also be a lesson for us?
Yeah, I think it should be of concern to us. I think the rising prosperity of authoritarian states, such as the People's Republic of China over the last 20 years, has given them the resources to export their model of authoritarianism around the world, whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think we as democracies need to acknowledge that this is a very real threat. And I think we have slowly come to this realization over the last decade. I think beyond 10 years ago, I think we wrongly assumed that along with increasing prosperity in these authoritarian states, that they would gradually improve their record on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. But the opposite has happened. All they have done is taken this newfound wealth and reinforced this authoritarianism, using technology, using other methods to repress their people. But going back to an earlier point you made about sunlight and transparency and disclosure, one of the things that we are based on is freedom of speech, freedom of expression, a belief in transparency and sunlight. That is not something authoritarian states are based on. They're based on the very opposite principle. So I think by naming and shaming bad actors, by using intelligence and making some of that public to name and shame bad actors, I think we'll go a long way in countering this threat.
Great, thank you. Thanks again for your courage, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again, sir.
I'd like to now yield to the ranking member, Jim McGovern.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank you for being here. The concern that is not just about social media outlets that China can control or has a greater influence on. I mean, I just plugged in to Twitter Maui fire causes, and things come up like from the Desert Review, whatever the hell that is. I have no idea, but basically it echoes the stuff that China's been putting out that somehow there's some mysterious causes to these fires. There's a number of posts. It doesn't say Chinese government posted them. They obviously have sympathizers and people who promote conspiracy theories. But we have a problem, again, as a country that believes in free speech, and freedom of expression. We have a problem on our own social media platforms with disinformation being put out there. And in the case of Twitter, now X, all the kind of review procedures that used to be in place are gone. We're reading about the attacks on the Anti-Defamation League that were raising issues about anti-Semitic posts that were being placed online, and the response to really try to destroy the integrity of the ADL is really quite stunning. And so it's like, how do you get these social media platform executives who oversee this to actually be more responsible? And so it's not just about naming and shaming the Chinese government, which we ought to do because of what they're doing, but we have corporate leaders that tolerate this, in countries like ours. How do you get it? Do we name and shame them a little bit more?
Well, Representative McGovern, that's an excellent question. And this is where I think like-minded democracies could really learn from each other on best practices and different models. So, for example, the European Union has a model to counter disinformation. The European Commission has set up a unit within the EC to counter disinformation in real time that's springing up on social media platforms. On the other hand, a very different model is the Taiwanese model. Taiwan is ground zero for the PRC's disinformation operations. Both the PRC and Taiwan share a common language. And so they are ground zero for this disinformation. And they've taken a very different approach. I was recently part of a delegation to Taiwan where I met with Audrey Tang, who's the minister, the new inaugural Minister of Digital Affairs. And she told me about their policy, which is a very different approach. It's grounded in resiliency, it's grounded in the education system, the primary and high school education system, and in civil society, empowering civil society groups to counter this disinformation. So this is where I think we can learn from each other on best practices, on what works, what doesn't. At the end of the day, we have to balance two competing things. One is to counter this disinformation while upholding freedom of the media and freedom of speech.
Yeah, in the level of disinformation that is being peddled on various social media platforms, I really think undercuts our democracy and our very freedoms that we care about. And it's always frustrating to me that we can't seem to come to a consensus on what disinformation is. And so we don't want to be in the business of censorship, but there ought to be some mechanism that clearly calls out lies and disinformation and conspiracy theories and attacks on individuals, even if they're very subtle, for what they are. And so I think this is a real challenge that some of it is putting pressure on China. Some of it is putting pressure on the platforms that allow people to traffic these lies and these threats on. The other thing, as I said in the beginning, I'm worried about attacks against people on these various platforms, but I am also, quite frankly, very worried about the other forms of transnational repression, including assassinations, illegal deportations, abductions, and family intimidation and Interpol abuse. The potential for the abuse of Interpol is well known and long-standing. Do you have any specific recommendations for reform of the Interpol system to combat transnational repression?
Well, I think we do need to take a look at reforming Interpol in light of the bounties and demand for arrest of 8 pro-Hong Kong democracy activists who are abroad. I think we've got to make sure that Interpol isn't used as a tool by the PRC to arrest and detain these individuals. I think of a Canadian, Hussein Jalil, who was wrongfully arrested in outside of the PRC, I believe in Turkmenistan, a number of years ago, and then extradited to the PRC, and his whereabouts is completely unknown. And the PRC won't tell the Canadian government where he is being detained or even if he is alive. And his wife and children live in Burlington, Ontario, just a couple miles up from north of the border, north of New York State. And it's so corrosive, that kind of tactic, because it sends a message to the rest of the community in Canada. If they dare to speak up, if they dare to stand up, they may be arrested abroad and taken to the PRC.
Yeah, well, and I think we need to do a better job of coordinating with other like-minded countries, that when another country has somebody who is seeking asylum, and yet China has a particular hold over the country where that person may be seeking refuge, and are thinking of deporting him or her back to China. I mean, we ought to be more coordinated in our efforts to try to provide a circle of protection around those individuals. But this is an important topic, and the abuse of these various platforms to target people, to discredit people, to spread conspiracy theories, I mean, is proliferated in a way that I don't think any of us could have imagined when social media first came into being. And I mean, it's hard to figure out how to put the genie back in the bottle, but we need, and maybe the counteroffensive that are more truth tellers, trying to influence on social media, and we need to, maybe we need to try to establish a group of people to set the record straight. But again, I was interested when I Googled, Maui fires. When I plugged it in on Twitter, two conspiracy theories appear, both that are being peddled by the Chinese government. But I appreciate your courage, and I appreciate your advocacy, and I look forward to working with you in the months ahead. I yield back.
Commissioner Zinke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to thank you for being here. It's not easy to stand up for freedom, and it takes a lot of courage, and thanks. I'd like to ask your thoughts on Chinese capabilities and priorities, perhaps, on industrial espionage, in particular, the high-tech sector.
Well, thank you, Representative Zinke, for that question. It's a very serious area of foreign interference. Our security services have told us that the PRC is a threat in 2 ways in 5 areas. They are a threat to our national security, and they're a threat to us in the form of the theft of intellectual property. And that is in particular in 5 sensitive areas of research and development at our leading universities and in our leading Canadian companies. And those 5 areas are telecommunications, 5G telecommunications, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, biopharma, and clean technologies. And so I think what we should be doing is banning any government funding of research in partnership with PRC entities in those 5 sensitive areas of research. And so whether it's the 4 Canadian granting councils, or in the United States here, the National Institutes of Health and other granting councils, I think we need to make it clear that we won't fund research in those 5 areas. That's in partnership with PRC entities. I think we also need to ban research in partnership with any entity affiliated with the People's Liberation Army.
And let me follow up. A concern when you talk about green technologies is EV. It sounds so nice. And I am all for cleaner is better, et cetera. But I'm concerned about the supply chain. Because in order to power EV, it takes batteries. And just a cursory look at the supply chain, when you look at what is required for a battery, well, lithium, cobalt. So who controls the mining of lithium, cobalt, and those other materials? And then the chips, who's making the chips that runs it? and the production, and it goes on, and then of course the other side of it is what do you do when the battery is ended its life cycle? You know, in the US, 90% of the solar cells that are no longer useful because of the technology and different reasons are just thrown into a landfill someplace across the country. We have no plan on what the disposal of the toxic batteries and liability. So I'm concerned on the EV world on that, because it seems like we're pushing an agenda without looking at the engine behind it, and the engine seems to be Chinese. Do you share that same concern?
Yes, I share that concern. I think there's two ways in which Canada can be a stronger partner to the United States in that regard. I think first off, we are a vast country with immense natural resources. We have critical minerals of our own that can be part of the North American automobile supply chain, and I think that's an area in which we can work more closely with the United States. I think the second area, though, is equally important. We're the 5th largest natural gas producer in the world, and we currently don't have an LNG export facility to get our natural gas to global markets. And if we can get those terminals built, if we can export natural gas to international markets and more natural gas to the United States, we can accomplish two goals. First, we can help reduce global emissions, because 1/5 of global emissions come from coal-fired electricity plants in places like the People's Republic of China. We can cut those emissions in half overnight by transitioning those plants to natural gas. And secondly, we can help displace authoritarian oil and gas from authoritarian states and replace it with oil and gas produced here from democracies. And I think particularly when it comes to Germany and Japan, which are currently buying vast amounts of gas from authoritarian states, that they should be buying their gas from Canada instead and from the United States. And so those are two ways in which I think we can help the United States. We've got critical minerals of our own, and we've got vast amounts of natural gas that we need to get to international markets.
It seems like on both sides we have hurdles for our national gas exports, but you're actually right. I mean, no one does it cleaner, better than North America. And if you want to look at how not to produce energy, I'll take you on a tour of Russia or the Middle East. The other point I think is important, you look at dependency and who is dependent on who and for what. On critical minerals that you mentioned, a look at it is that there's some critical minerals that they have the entirety of the supply chain. And it's not a secret. Well, one of them happens to be germanium. And it turns out germanium is needed for lenses, especially high definition lenses that you might want to put on military hardware, thermal optics, matter of fact, almost everything we use. But when critical minerals are locked up and we can't get to the resources, we have germanium here, but the germanium permit is almost impossible to get. And while technology in the battlefield changes every 2 years, we're waiting 25 years for a permit. And I would agree that absolutely the the pipeline, which is about 18 inches, would both reduce overall emissions and help us shore up our energy needs. Natural gas pipelines. Do you see any success in your current government on this issue?
Well, I think you're exactly right. We need regulatory reform in Canada to reduce the regulatory hurdles to approving natural resource projects. In fact, the government of Canada itself has acknowledged that. Finance Minister Freeland was actually here in Washington last year and said that Canada needs to expedite the approval of these natural resource projects to get our projects to resources to market to help our allies. He was very explicit about that. I await the Canadian government's plans in that regard. It can be done. I'll give you one example of how a democracy did it. Germany, after the war in Ukraine began, realized that it had a complete reliance on Russian natural gas and that those pipelines were being shut down. We know one of them was blown up in the Baltic Sea, and the other one never came online. And so Germany had to scramble. Well, within days after last February's invasion, they approved 6 new LNG terminals in the Baltic and North Sea. One of them came online in a record roughly 6 months from approval to live operation in Wilhelmshaven, which is a port, I believe, in the North Sea. So democracies like Canada can expedite these projects. We just need the political will to do so, and I think it's critical that we do that.
I look forward to working with that. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Ms. Salinas?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chong, we've been talking a little bit about science and technology, and I actually serve on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, where we frequently discuss issues around research security, especially in the context of economic competition with China. International research collaboration does have significant benefits, but reports suggest that our efforts to crack down on bad actors have actually caused many Chinese American researchers to leave positions at American universities, and I understand this. How can we balance protecting against real, legitimate, and dangerous threats from the Chinese government and their influence on college campuses and fostering a welcoming environment for students and researchers at North American universities where we really want to make true advancements?
Well, that's a great question. You know, we have to balance academic freedom with the need to protect national security in sensitive areas of research. And I think what's one critical element in doing that is being open and transparent about what research will be funded and what won't be funded. And I think that will clear the suspicion. I think in the absence of clear policies about what the government will fund and what it won't fund because it crosses a line, I think you clear a lot of the suspicion away. And so my view is, in the Canadian context, we should be clear that we will not fund research partnerships and research that is done in collaboration with PRC entities in the 5 sensitive areas of research that I identified, and secondly, in research partnerships with the People's Liberation Army. I don't think there's any research that the Canadian government should fund that's done in collaboration with the PRC's military. And so if we put those policies in place and also then simply advise universities that we think that there are security risks if you on your own decide to fund those research partnerships, if you decide to do those partnerships in those 5 sensitive areas, then I think we empower our university community, our academics, to do the right thing, and I'm confident that they will, and that they'll know where the lines are, and I think that clears a lot of the suspicion about any research that's being conducted with researchers from the PRC.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you so very much. Mr. Chong, thank you for your testimony. Without objection, your full statement and any materials you would like to include in the record will be made a part of the record. But thank you for your clarity, for your boldness, for your courage. It is greatly appreciated and greatly respected south of the border, that is to say, the Canadian border.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and we look forward to building a stronger defense and security partnership with the United States.
Appreciate it so much. Thank you. I'd like to now introduce our second panel, and beginning is a very, very fantastic group of experts and leaders, including those who have unfortunately been victimized by China's transnational repression and those who have studied and witnessed it up close. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Yana Gorokhovskaya, the Research Director for Strategy and Design at Freedom House. Yana has a PhD from the University of British Columbia and has been published in peer-reviewed journalists and outlets such as Foreign Affairs, Politico, The Guardian, The Washington Post, and Just Security. At Freedom House, Yana oversees research which quantifies trends towards and away from global freedom and democracy, as well as monitoring transnational repression. She has co-authored 2 reports on the topic in recent years: Still Not Safe, Transnational Repression in 2022, and Defending Democracy in Exile, Policy Responses to Transnational Repression. Next, we will hear from Ms. Laura Harth, Campaign Director at Safeguard Defenders, a human rights NGO that protects human rights, promotes the rule of law, and works to enhance local civil society capacity in some of Asia's most hostile environments. Focused on the PRC, it also works to counter growing transnational repression by the Chinese Communist Party. around the world through its direct action, research, and advocacy efforts. Indeed, you may recognize the organization's name from a groundbreaking investigation they released exactly a year ago, entitled 110 Overseas Chinese Transnational Policing Gone Wild, in which they exposed the abhorrent lengths to which the CCP has gone to maintain control over people outside its borders, including the establishment of at least 54 police-run overseas police service centers across 5 continents to carry out Chinese police operations on foreign soil, including right here in the United States. Laura also covers external relations for the Interparliamentary Alliance on China and acts as advisor to Hong Kong Watch. Then we will hear from Rushan Abbas, a Uyghur American activist who has dedicated her life to championing the rights of the Uyghur people and a great friend of this commission. Rushan began her advocacy at Xinjiang University, where she courageously led pro-democracy protests in 1985 and again in 1988. After relocating to the U.S. in '89, she co-founded the Uyghur Overseas Student and Scholars Association, that was in 1993, and played a pivotal role in establishing the Uyghur American Association in 1998, and was elected as vice president for 2 terms. In response to Beijing's escalating genocidal actions against the Uyghurs in 2017, Ms. Abbas co-founded the Campaign for Uyghurs, or CFU. In 2020, CFU released its report, Genocide in East Turkestan, meticulously detailing how the PRC's atrocities make it subject to strictures of the Genocide Convention. Notably, CFU received the Nobel Peace Prize nomination in February of 2022 for its tireless advocacy. Indeed, for the record, it was former Commissioner Tom Swansea and I who made the nomination. Tom and I also launched the Uyghur Caucus here in Congress, and now I co-lead that with Jennifer Wexton, and we hope to relaunch that again very soon. Rushan has a personal story to relate as well. In 2018, her family members underwent the unthinkable. After her first public speech in September of 2018, the CCP abducted and detained her sister, Gulshan, in China as retaliation for her activism. She remains in custody. So I welcome our very, very distinguished witnesses. And now, Yana, I yield the floor to you.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Smith, Co-Chairman Merkley, and the distinguished members of the Commission for the opportunity to share information about the scope and scale of the global transnational repression campaign carried out by the People's Republic of China. Today, I'll use my time to describe how the PRC tries to silence people living abroad, as well as how this campaign has evolved. I'll conclude with some suggestions about the ways that democratic governments can better protect people who are targeted by the PRC. I'll begin with this simple fact. The People's Republic of China today is one of the least free countries in the world. It now ranks near the very bottom among 195 countries assessed in Freedom in the World, which is our global survey of political rights and civil liberties. The domestic situation is important to understand because, like other authoritarian governments, the PRC exports oppression abroad as a way of maintaining the regime at home. Even though Chinese officials routinely reference the government's policy of non-interference, Beijing seeks to dictate, sometimes through the use of physical force, the terms of free speech, association, movement, assembly, and even religious expression of individuals who are thousands of miles away. China is carrying out the world's most sophisticated and comprehensive campaign of transnational repression, using a wide array of physical, digital, and psychological tactics to attempt to silence those it views as a threat. According to a database that Freedom House maintains, the PRC is responsible for about 30% of all recorded physical incidents of transnational repression globally since 2014. It has conducted campaigns in at least 36 countries, including in democracies like the United States. As Chairman Smith and Co-Chairman Merkley already noted, Beijing targets a very diverse array of people. Pro-democracy activists, journalists, students, human rights defenders, artists, former insiders, civil society organizations, and whole ethnic and religious groups, like the Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Falun Gong practitioners, as well as anyone else who is brave enough to criticize the Chinese Communist Party. It uses many different tactics to try to silence people. One of the most harmful and hard to address tactics is the intimidation of family, or coercion by proxy. Harassment of family members still living in China can be psychologically devastating for people seeking to promote human rights and to advocate for freedom. Commission members already noted how the PRC seeks to manipulate mechanisms of international cooperation like Interpol and extradition agreements. And I want to pause to point out two important cases. One is the case of Idris Hassan. Idris was detained in March of 2021 when he landed in an airport in Casablanca on a red notice that was issued by China. 2.5 years later, he's still in prison, despite the fact that the red notice was canceled shortly after his arrest. Idris is at risk of being deported to China every single day because Morocco and China have an extradition agreement. And worryingly, China is actively pursuing the ratification of more extradition agreements, as our colleagues at Safeguard Defenders and Access Society have well documented. Liu Saiwei, also in Laos, faces imminent deportation, and his situation is also very worrying. The PRC's toolkit of repression is evolving in dangerous ways. For example, evidence has recently emerged that the PRC is co-opting former members of domestic law enforcement agencies to harass, coerce, stalk, and surveil people living both in the US and in Canada. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Justice, and their Canadian counterparts have begun to examine these cases. However, I want to underline that the involvement of former law enforcement officials in transnational repression campaigns may amplify, rightfully, the fear that members of the diaspora feel because it demonstrates that the PRC is able to deputize officials in democratic states to carry out its repressive schemes. The PRC is the world's worst abuser of internet freedom domestically. It employs digital tactics of transnational repression as well. These tactics, which include mass trolling, smear campaigns, threats and intimidation, spoofing of accounts, and even doxing of personal information, are meant to first intimidate, drown out reports of human rights abuses, and apply psychological pressure. I also want to note that these tactics are gendered. Women face not only violent but sexualized threats online in response to their work or their activism that shines a critical light on the PRC. The PRC's campaign of transnational repression is a threat to sovereignty, democratic institutions, and human rights. Building resilience and imposing accountability are key. I'd like to conclude today by sharing some of Freedom House's recommendations for how to better protect people. I'll start with one that I think many on this commission are already working on, codifying a definition of transnational repression. This will facilitate the tracking of incidents, distinguish attacks from ordinary crime, and coordinate interagency action in addition to serving as a basis for any other laws that may be needed. The second is training for government officials, including law enforcement, who may encounter transnational repression, to make sure that officials are equipped with matching and sufficient information to protect those who are at risk. The third is conducting strategic, consistent, and culturally sensitive outreach to communities that are at risk of experiencing transnational repression in order to equip them with the resources they need to report these incidents. The fourth is using voice and vote to limit the ability of Interpol member states to misuse red alerts and other kinds of notices. And finally, deploying targeted sanctions against Chinese officials for the use of transnational repression, as well as screening Chinese diplomats for a history of harassing diaspora members while at their postings. I should note that several pieces of legislation to address transnational repression have been introduced or will be introduced in the near future. And I want to say again, thank you to Co-Chairman Merkley and Chairman Smith for your introduction of the Transnational Repression Policy Act, which Freedom House supports. We look forward to working with you to see that it passes into law. Addressing transnational repression committed by the government of the People's Republic of China is a matter of urgency. It is imperative that Congress, in a bipartisan fashion, come together with the executive branch and like-minded partners to protect those who are at risk and to defend democratic institutions. We appreciate the leadership of the Commission on this issue, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for your testimony and your recommendations. Ms. Harth.
Thank you so much, Chairman Smith, Co-Chairman Merkley, distinguished members of the Commission. Good morning. It is truly an honor to testify before you today on behalf of Safeguard Defenders. As was already said, most people will know us, if they know us, for the report released exactly 1 year ago today, which exposed a formal cooperation between public security authorities in China and united front-linked groups around the world in the setting up and running of so-called overseas police service centers. Now, counter to what PRC authorities and their propaganda mouthpieces continue to say, even over the weekend and today, these stations are not just in open violation of the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. Open source evidence, exclusively from Chinese authorities and state party media, links such stations directly to so-called persuasion to return operations, including video evidence from such an operation taking place in Spain. Now, as is often the case when yet another Chinese foreign interference story breaks, and we've obviously just heard from Canada with the Honorable Michael Chong, or seen the fallout over the weekend over an alleged spy in Westminster, the reports on police stations presented somewhat of a rude awakening for many democratic governments that had previously been very reluctant to engage on the issue of transnational repression coming from China. While overseas police stations definitely jump-started a growing series of conversations, these are clearly but the tip of the iceberg in what members of the dissident communities have long known and what Freedom House rightly defines as the world's most sophisticated, comprehensive, and far-reaching campaign of transnational repression. Within this campaign, Safeguard Defenders focuses our direct action and documentation efforts on countering one of its most extreme iterations, that of involuntary returns. While these are not new, the scale on which PRC authorities are coercing individuals to return to China to face prosecution has exploded over the course of the past decade, with official yet partial numbers released annually under Operation Fox Hunt and Skynet, claiming well over 10,000 returns from over 120 countries between 2014 and October 2022. And we will soon release additional evidence on such operations taking place around the world. The often clandestine methods for these returns have been set in stone by the CCP's Central Commission for Discipline Inspection in a written legal interpretation to the 2018 National Supervision Law that vastly expanded this non-judicial body's reach. Extradition, repatriation, off-site prosecution, persuasion, luring and entrapment, and even kidnapping are among the official policies used by PRC authorities. The so-called persuasion to return method is the one used most frequently. Threats and harassment, or worse, against family members back home, or direct threats and harassment of individuals overseas by covert agents, individuals linked to PRC embassies or consulates, private investigators and security firms, co-opted private individuals, rabid nationalists, or even victims themselves. The Chinese Communist Party has set up a true whole-of-society effort to exert control over diaspora communities worldwide and silence dissent. These efforts clearly undermine the most fundamental freedoms of targeted communities, severely infringe the rights and due process of individuals coerced into returning, and constitute a grave violation of the territorial and judicial sovereignty of other nations. The climate of suspicion and widespread fear further isolate targeted communities and individuals from their environments. They may also expose individuals that have been co-opted or coerced into doing the CCP's bidding to criminal liability. As has often been said, to effectively counter such a massive undertaking, democracies need to respond with a similar whole-of-government approach that recognizes transnational repression for the domestic threat it is, one that is inextricably linked to the CCP's influence operations. Now, speaking from a European perspective, we are really but at the very beginning of such an endeavor, and will need continued, concerted allied efforts to move beyond the stage of timid condemnation to effective and coordinated transnational counteraction to match the CCP's efforts. Working towards joint definitions, sharing of information and best practices, as well as the coherent application of set standards, are an essential step in this direction. It is, in our view, equally key to end the legitimization of the PRC's illegal practices through judicial and police cooperation agreements, at the bilateral but also at the multilateral level. It is no coincidence the PRC has been pushing the signing and ratifying of such agreements at an accelerated rate during the same time frame in which its involuntary returns operations have exploded. Some may remember the example of the joint police patrols that seemed, at the very least, conducive to the pilot run of overseas police stations in Italy, something the Italian authorities have since recognized as being imprudent. But it doesn't end with such examples, nor does it end with the examples of extradition agreements or Interpol abuse. In particular, I'd like to use this occasion to severely question the legitimacy of the UN Office on Drugs and Crimes MOU with the CCP's Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, that same body I mentioned before, as the Chinese focal point for all work under the Convention Against Corruption. Not only does PRC propaganda dub these types of agreements as a demonstration of the international community's trust in its judicial system, they directly contribute to a heightened sense of fear within targeted communities, gravely subvert the international rules-based order, and often act as a gateway to similar agreements at the bilateral level, especially in the Global South. Ending such legitimization is a crucial part in rebuilding trust with the targeted communities that are key to understanding emerging threats and actors. Personally, I believe the biggest compliment we have received for our work is that of victims across Europe stating they finally found audiences eager for their stories and experiences. To them, I want to say, we need more of your stories. Authorities need to hear more of your stories. The US and Australia have already set up exemplary, multilingual, dedicated hotlines to report transnational repression efforts, also anonymously. To encourage this best practice elsewhere, Safeguard Defenders has today released a pilot guide with reporting channels in a series of countries, which we will continue to update and hopefully grow with similarly dedicated hotlines. So if you or others have been the target of transnational repression, please report to the relevant authorities. Please report to the FBI if you are in this country. Only by coming together can we begin to effectively push back against the CCP's efforts. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Senator Merkley has a vote pending over on the Senate side. He has to run to make it, so he'll...
Including stopping the export of products made in order to create international pressure to change those tactics. I want to turn to your testimony on the Freedom House, and I appreciate so much your organization's work, but I wanted to highlight one piece of your testimony about the use of retired police officers. And have you seen this as a significant, sustained strategy that is being employed by China?
Thank you. We've seen a few instances of it. I think much of the issue is that people who retire from either law enforcement or even sometimes from the DHS have specific skills and networks of contacts that make them very valuable and employable as private investigators. And they take contracts, which sometimes originate in China or Iran, to collect information. And we've seen this, there was also prosecutions recently in New York. We've seen a case like this with the RCMP in Canada. And this is an extremely dangerous practice and probably speaks to the need for more regulation of private investigators and transparency about where that work is coming from, on behalf of whom they're collecting this information.
And let me also turn to your mention about red notices. We've had hearings and testimony on this before this committee before, trying to draw attention and diminishing China's ability to use red notices, reducing the ability for countries to cooperate with them. Are we having any impact? Is it becoming harder for China to use red notices to detain people and use extradition agreements to return people home?
I think there's a great deal of attention to China's misuse of red notices, as well as misuse of red notices by other countries like Russia. However, as the case of Idris Hassan, I think, demonstrates, the problem is that even when the red notice is pulled back, when it's canceled, you can still be detained. The effect is that you are still imprisoned, and then other mechanisms kick in, whether that's the police co-op. The fact that this information is still shared and can be acted on is a serious problem. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Harth, you talk about in the 110 overseas, and I gather 110 is a reference to the emergency number that you would dial in China. And is that a name that you all have given the Chinese tactic, or is that one that China uses?
I believe it was used by at least one of the authorities, and the documentation we reviewed as, a 110 overseas, a kind of slogan to define these overseas services that they were offering. But it's not a consistent name used by all the public security authorities.
So they're, on one level, advertising services to Chinese diaspora, legitimate services, but using these service stations to coordinate transnational repression.
Yeah, I believe there were two issues with these overseas stations. Also on the side of the administrative or consular services they were offering, which in many cases may well have been in violation of the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, because obviously private individuals are not allowed to establish consular services or others at free will. On the other hand, we found concrete evidence, and I wish to highlight, exclusively on the basis of open source evidence from PRC sources, that these stations had indeed been used for, we found evidence of 84 persuasion to return operations, and that evidence in one case included video evidence of such an operation taking place between a station in Spain and the public security authorities in China.
And this is what you're referring to when you talk about China's patrol and persuade campaign. Monitor what Chinese diaspora are doing and persuade them to stop, or persuade them to perhaps report on others who are criticizing China?
So in our case, we use persuade to refer to the persuasion to return operations, which is a term used by the PRC, their most preferred methodology to bring people back, to coerce people to go back to China. But the patrol obviously refers to the control and harassment potentially of people overseas more in general.
And that persuasion to return home to China, the main instrument used is threats to their family members back home should they not return?
Absolutely.
Threats to do what to the family members back home?
Threats may include the detention of family members, interrogations, calling them into police stations, disappearing family members, taking away their jobs, taking away certain benefits. The threats are actually doing all those things, even prosecute family members instead of the target overseas.
And you refer to Operation Fox Hunt. 2014 through 2022, I think the stat you have in here is 10,000 returns in your testimony. Is that the Chinese government saying that they've persuaded 10,000 people to return home through this strategy?
So official numbers released annually by the CCDI, Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, on Fox Hunt and Skynet lists close to 12,000 returns between 2014 and October 2022, and we're obviously waiting for the new data possibly at the end of October.
So 12,000 cases, I mean, they're kind of bragging about having persuaded people to return home, which sends a huge message if the intimidation is that successful, threatening family members back home. I mean, this is not encouraging university students to return to use their education back home. This is encouraging people to return back home who have critiqued China abroad.
Who exactly they're going after under these campaigns is not always clear, especially when it comes to Fox Hunt and Skynet. These are people typically accused of corruption, financial crimes. Now, if those accusations are correct, is obviously very hard to say, knowing the Chinese system.
Do we have any sense of that number? And I think you corrected me that it's 12,000. Of their distribution, do they report on the distribution between countries of those numbers? No. Okay. Well, I must say, even the term and that title, Operation Fox Hunt, that's the Chinese name for this operation. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we have a lot of work to do to address this expanding strategy. And I appreciate from Freedom House the 5 recommendations that you mentioned. I did want to ask you, Ms. Harth, you mentioned that the United States has an exemplary, we've been asking for a dedicated hotline from the FBI, but they keep telling us they just want to keep using their general tip line. Are we unaware of something that has been established here in the United States?
So I was referring to the multilingual guides that they have put out describing transnational repression, making it sure that when instances are reported, that it is centralized, that it is looked at, that people that receive those calls or messages know what they're talking about. And coming from overseas, I can tell you that is very much exemplary indeed.
Okay, well, maybe in the international comparison we're doing well, but we are pushing for there to be a dedicated way for people to report transnational repression, including linguists appropriate to the countries that are the major offenders. But I don't think we're quite there yet. But I appreciate that we're at some level we're making some impact, but we're not where we want to get to. Thank you so much, all 3 of you, for your bringing your expertise to bear in this really big issue that concerns the ability to have the freedom of speech and assembly that we cherish so much, and yet so directly threatened by these tactics. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
I hope you make your vote. Ms. Ruchon of us.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Chairman Merkley, members of the committee, and all the staff at the Commission. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak today. The committee is well aware of the CCP's endless list of genocidal crimes being carried out against the Uyghurs and the other Turkic groups in East Turkestan, also known as Xinjiang. Today, I will speak about the Chinese regime's use of transnational repression to stifle defiance and hide their crimes, Beijing's tactics of intimidation, and the hostage-taking to silence Uyghurs have global effect. Through these measures, the CCP violates the First Amendment rights of American citizens residing within the US soil. The totalitarian rule from China extends beyond its borders, oppressing the US citizens. In 2018, we received the news that 24 of my husband, Abdul Hakim Idris's family members were missing and likely detained in the camps. On September 5th, 2018, I spoke about the growing number of the mass detention and exposed the CCP's genocidal policies at the Hudson Institute here in Washington. 6 days later, my sister, Gulshan Abbas, was unjustly detained by the regime in retaliation for my activism and my free speech as a US citizen. Yesterday marks the 5th anniversary of her being taken from our lives. The Chinese regime has maintained silence about her situation, while their mouthpiece Global Times Network spread misinformation and accusing me of fabricating my claims about her disappearances. Later, the Chinese MOFA confirmed her false imprisonment, all based on fabricated charges. My sister Gulshan has no political history and is a retired medical doctor, a mother, and a grandma who continues to suffer in China's prison. For 5 long years, my niece Ziba has put her life on hold, relentlessly fighting for her mother's freedom. Witnessing her journey is incredibly painful as she navigates working, raising her 5-year-old daughter, while grappling with the overwhelming loss and the trauma of having her mother held hostage because of me. Recently, We just learned that my father-in-law, Abdul Karim Zikrullah Idris, passed away in January of this year. My husband lost contact with his family in April 2017. After over 6 years, all we know is that his father passed away 7 months ago. The exact date and the circumstances surrounding his death are unknown. My mother-in-law, Habiba Khan Idris, is said to be outside the camps, but she's in poor health, alone, and has no one to take care of her because of her 4 children, and all her grandchildren are still missing and likely detained. The plight of my sister and my in-laws are one of many. Uyghurs in the United States are facing the most significant crisis of our lives, but many of us are afraid to speak out because of what might happen to our lives back home in our homeland. Our efforts to raise awareness and advocate for change are targeted and undermined. Remember when we used to have this sort of hearings at the Hill before, a room full of Uyghurs used to join you with holding their pictures of their family members missing? But today, you don't see many. They are afraid of coming to the public events like this as a direct result of TNR. I face daily online attacks with hate and misinformation spread through the CCP bot accounts. Uyghur activists, including myself, are subject to libel and harassment, fostering mistrust and hatred. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube offer no protection. Today, I urge you to protect Uyghur American citizens. This call is reinforced through my written testimony and the policy recommendations. I returned from Almaty, Kazakhstan last night. We were there for a film festival featuring the documentary In Search of My Sister, which highlights my story and my sister's detention. When we arrived there, the venue canceled the event. The supposed reasons for the cancellation vary. Some cites a visit of 2 Chinese diplomats to the venue the day before. Others point to the Kazakh government. Nonetheless, it's clear that the CCP is ultimately responsible for suppressing this event. The CCP is an evident threat to freedom and democracy in the world. China's international policing, intimidation, and harassment tactics extend to everyone, as highlighted by Honorable Mr. Chong and the experts here. I am, as a female activist, personally experiencing everything that Yana described earlier. China's economic and technological power gives the government significant sway, causing self-censorship and silence in various American industries. The CCP influence undermines American values and global freedom. And as long as our families are detained in prison, concentration camps, forced into slavery with forced labor, forced into marriages, facing forced sterilizations, and the forced abortion, and the kidnapping, all Uyghurs worldwide are direct victims of this genocide. Urgent action is necessary to protect not just my sister, my in-laws, and the millions of the Uyghurs, but the entire world. Only through collective efforts can we safeguard Americans from China's infiltration and the normalization of TNR here at home. I ask that we work together to preserve democracy and the freedom and human rights. If we do not stand to hold the CCP accountable today, we will most certainly lose the privilege tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for your testimony, for your incredible courage for speaking out, and for the agony you have suffered personally for your sister. I remember when Tom Swazi did the showing of your documentary, which again you showed again. I believe it's the same one yesterday. You know, it's very moving, and I think we ought to do it again here on Capitol Hill, you know, with the speaker and others, so they can see just how barbaric and cruel the Chinese Communist Party really is in taking hostages of family members and friends for people who speak out as you have done so bravely. So I would offer that to you. I thank you for traveling 25 hours on a plane to get here to testify. I mean, that again is a personal sacrifice on behalf of your sister and all Uyghurs. And again, if we don't, as a country, and if the West and the democracies do not begin calling out aggressively the abuses of Xi Jinping, the abuses will only multiply. And so the idea behind this hearing, behind our legislation on transnational crimes that are being committed by so-called police and others on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party here and elsewhere, it's time to put a tourniquet on it all. It just has to happen because it's only going to get worse. So I thank you. I do have a few questions, but I do want to point out that I mentioned it earlier about Liu Shiwei, who we're all concerned about in Laos. Yesterday, 164 Chinese nationals were renditioned from Laos to China, and there's fear that, of course, Liu Shiwei may be part of a forcible return. The whole idea of calling it persuasion to return or anything like that, although that has to do with trying to persuade people, but to these governments who then unwittingly or wittingly cooperate with a violation of refugee law, where you know people are going to be sent back to and have a well-founded fear of persecution, and that's where they're going back to. So I would hope that all of us would reach out to the administration, ask Michelle Outlaw, who's our chargé in Laos, to raise the issue of Liu Shiwei, and perhaps some of you might want to make mention of that now. And some of the questions I have, Laura Harth mentioned the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and the MOU with the CCP's Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, and what a farce it is. Such legitimization, as you point out, is a crucial part of, it legitimizes the illegitimate. And I'm not sure if you could speak to, has our U.S. Department of State spoken out on that MOU? Have we done it effectively? Because again, we can't look the other way when agreements are entered into by governments like this one with this. So maybe you want to speak to a little bit or elaborate on that very poor MOU.
Yeah, so maybe specifically on that agreement, so that memorandum of understanding was signed shortly after the 2018 reform of the National Supervision Law, which kind of created a state front for this internal CCP police, I think is the best way to describe it. The Central Commission for Discipline Inspection. Now, that state front is not independent in any way. It does not have independent employees. It does not report independently. It sits in the same offices, and all its representatives are the exact same people. So it is not a different body. As soon as that was set up, so their powers were vastly expanded, both within China through the formalization of a system called Liuzhe, which is effectively an extrajudicial system for enforced disappearances, torture, and so on. They call it a special investigative mechanism. It has been denounced by UN human rights bodies. At the same time, the CCDI, these bodies have been in charge of overseeing all international, let's say, police repatriation efforts. So clearly a very worrying body, and as I said before, it does not surprise us that they also started pushing this body for all international law enforcement and judicial cooperation. Now, that included famously an agreement, the first one I think, with the Australian Federal Police, which was signed only a couple of weeks after this reform. Luckily, the AFP has now, a couple of months back, recognized that that was a mistake that will not be made again, so that will not be renewed. In Denmark, a similar agreement existed that has also not been renewed, but a lot of agreements exist around the world, including this MOU. I think the most important thing that worries us is the fact that it has been appointed as focal point, and one of the issues there is obviously that also it's not just Interpol. Under this mechanism, there is police cooperation mechanisms. So far that I know, there's not been any public statements by countries on the UNODC mechanism. We'll definitely be raising that issue more. I can tell you that the UNODC has been unwilling to release the contents of that MOU or to provide civil society organizations such as ourselves with any further information.
Now, is that something that Secretary Blinken and the U.S. Department of State should be raising? Have they done so in any fora that you know of?
So again, I don't know what publicly, I haven't seen that happen. I don't know if that has happened privately. I definitely hope this would be something that, you know, allied countries in general, democratic nations in general, would be looking into more as they try to tackle the issue of transnational repression and the issue of the, you know, illegitimacy of what the CCP is trying to do here in really overturning the international rules-based order. Thank you.
It is something that we as a commission will undertake further. We already have, but more so. Perhaps this calls for a letter from commissioners, if they would be so inclined to sign, to our administration asking that this be raised. I mean, even the euphemism persuasion to return, you know, with broken bodies and broken hearts, especially of family members, in order to effectuate that forcible return. I mean, it flies in the face of the Refugee Convention and all parts thereof, even though and China is a signatory to it. I know it doesn't really apply here, but it's that concept of coercing people to involuntarily repatriate. So if you could provide us any more additional information you would think would be helpful, and we will ask Secretary Blinken to raise it. And I thank you for really bringing a spotlight to it today. I'd like to ask Rushan, if you could, in what ways should the U.S. government be more helpful to the diaspora like yourself who are suffering so much? Is there an outreach? Is there, I mean, does the FBI talk to you at all and to others? You know, do we have enough resources deployed? You know, obviously there's always a concern. Do you have enough people at the FBI and other agencies to do the work? Is the need not being staffed sufficiently, or is there a lack of you know, actual guidance coming from the administration?
Sorry. Yes, we have been talking to the FBI and the State Department and the other law enforcement, and it seems like they are on it, paying attention, but seems like there's not much they can do to people like ourselves, since all this libel, harassment, intimidations, and the blackmails online especially, they are protected under the freedom of speech. It's interesting how these platforms are not open to the general public in China. The regular, ordinary Chinese people cannot use YouTube or Twitter or Facebook and the other social media platforms. Yet, the Chinese officials or Chinese state media or those Chinese troll accounts constantly attacking us, harassing us. But when we reach out to FBI and the others, they are in touch with us and they constantly communicating with us, but we don't see any tangible help. We are already facing so much agony. Our family members are suffering. Every day, everything we do is at the cost of our family members' freedom. And especially, I wake up every day with my sister's face, and I go to bed with her face. And since her detention, my life completely changed. I quit my full-time job as a business development director, and every, you know, the dream or the ambition I had professionally for my life all evaporated in overnight. I became a full-time activist. I doubled down my efforts. Therefore, when I see those kind of attacks, which is daily, I take these as the impact of my work. We are speaking to the power, and we have the truth, and the Chinese communist regime is afraid of the truth. But at the same time, it frustrates me when I see absolutely nothing is being provided other than just the, interviews or talks or saying that they are doing something, but seems like it's extremely slow. We have been talking to FBI for over a year now. I don't see any kind of tangible action being provided.
Yana or Laura, did you have any sense as to how many Chinese operatives, police, and others are here in the United States, and how many they've deployed throughout the world to harass and intimidate?
No, I think it would be very hard to have a number on that. As said before, the issue is the number of actors is so wide between those that are, official agents that may have been deployed from China to come to other countries, those that may be stationed in embassies and consulates, and then, the whole host of private actors, semi-private actors that are being engaged. I think it's very hard to calculate. And I do want to make, if I may, a small note of caution, because as said, some of these people may be victims themselves. Now, that does not necessarily excuse what they are doing, but it is important to keep it in mind that a lot of these people may not have a choice themselves. And again, I think that just demonstrates how evil this regime is, because they do not care if those people, will then go and face criminal charges or anything else. So thank you.
Yana, no.
I would agree with that. I think it's very hard to estimate. I think we see the transnational repression and foreign influence play out in lots of different ways. There was discussion of what happens on university campuses. I think that's especially also something to watch. We saw a lot of students, Chinese students, taking up their own white paper protests last year in response to what was happening domestically in China. And frustratingly, a lot of those people were then, first of all, didn't get support from their universities, but also then faced reprisals, either threats on campus, threats to their families. And so I think the important thing is that every time we see pro-democracy, pro-human rights, pro-freedom activism, by people outside of China, we see a very harsh, very immediate response. And although there is action to support people like the FBI and other actions, there's still many people who are facing this don't feel like they have anywhere to turn, and they don't understand necessarily that there is solidarity, that they can reach out, and that people in the US government and other democratic governments understand that this is a problem.
Has there been a better understanding? Several years ago, I did a series of hearings on Confucius Institutes and their malign influence that they're having on the student body, especially Chinese students that they surveil. And of course, the one-sided political tirades that come from those people that implement it. It's all the party apparatus. I mean, don't talk about the Dalai Lama, don't talk about the Uyghurs, don't talk about, and many of our higher education, our universities, our colleges bought into it. Now, are you finding that this is part of that apparatus to this day? They're becoming even more repressive using Confucius Institutes or like-minded entities?
I think while the influence of Confucius Institutes has waned, we've seen other kind of facets of this be expressed. And I do think that one thing to caution is that this sometimes gets wrapped into a language of anti-Asian hate, that this is sort of harassment or racial profiling. And that's also to the PRC's advantage, because it pits people against each other, and it delegitimizes the voices of people who are speaking out for freedom. So I think the Confucius Institutes have become less of a problem, but I don't think that the influence has disappeared as a result of that.
Good point. Now, on the red notices, those of us who have read, pardon me, Bill Browder's book and have him, he's testified many times before us. He's done an amazing job, especially with the Magnitsky Act and the Global Magnitsky. And I was the House sponsor of the Global Magnitsky, and it's just a tremendous tool for the administration. But obviously, the abuse of red notices, what does Interpol do to mitigate that abuse, especially when it comes out of China or Russia or some other totalitarian country?
Well, one thing that can be done is to be more transparent about the number and the origin of notices. We don't know where the notices are coming from. People don't know that they have a notice against them often until they get arrested somewhere on a border. And that's something that Interpol can do. They do make some notices public. They can be more transparent so that people have an opportunity to look it up whether or not they are subject to a notice and actually appeal for that notice to be rescinded or canceled if there's grounds to do that. So that's one very concrete thing that Interpol can do.
Laura, could you just tell us how many countries, or do you have any sense of how many countries may have unwittingly signed agreements which allow for these illicit extraditions?
I'd have to come back to you on that, but there's definitely a huge number of, it's not just extradition agreements, police, judicial cooperation agreements. It doesn't stop, and yeah. But I'll get back to you on that.
Okay. Anything else you would like to add before we conclude the hearing? And Rashawn, know that your sister will remain a high priority for this commission and you and others who are in that similar situation. I do thank you, especially, we all do, for your courage in coming forward. Injustice need not be forever, and the heroes of democracy and human rights are you and your sister and others who are fighting so tenaciously and paying for it with the loss of their freedom. So thank you for that sacrifice. I can't tell you how in awe I am and my colleagues are of what you have suffered and what you persevere to continue to bring the message to the world about what is happening by Xi Jinping. So thank you. Thank you so much. The hearing is adjourned.